INFOWARS with your host, David Knight.
Welcome back. I want to take a look at Iran. I want to take a look at what is happening, especially what is happening with former Obama administration officials trying to create a wedge between the U.S. and Europe. It's amazing to me, not only what John Kerry is doing, but what former Obama officials are doing. And as we look at the bigger picture in Iran, we've got an election that took place over the weekend. They're still counting the final votes, but they're expecting that the cleric, Muqtada al-Sadr, and his moving forward bloc has a substantial lead. And who are these people? Well, he is a Shia, and of course that means that he is allied with Iran politically, because you understand that these different sects, Shia, Sunni, Wahhabi, they are all have their political alliances as well. And so Iran is Shia. Iran has pushed Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Hezbollah had major electoral victories just a week, maybe 2 weeks ago, that they had their election in Lebanon, and that is now controlled by an Iranian political ally, an Iranian religious ally, the Shia factor there, the Hezbollah, and the same thing has now happened in Iraq. And so when you want to look at ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere, it's starting to look like a Shia state. And one of these, they said both Sadr's bloc, which is the moving forward bloc, and a bloc that is loyal to Hadi al-Amiri. He is head of the Badr Brigade. Now, this is the military wing of an Iranian-based Shia Islamic Party. So in Iran, they have the Shia Islamic Party, and these people are the military wing of that, and they are in Iraq. And of course, they are going to be ruling Iraq along with this other Shia cleric. That's the situation that is developing in Iraq. Iran, meanwhile, is threatening to expose the U.S. diplomats who took bribes in order to create the nuclear deal. Maybe that's why John Kerry is so furiously moving back and forth to try to keep this thing going. He's trying to keep Iran happy, because if that doesn't happen, as I said, we will reveal which Western politicians and how much money they received during the nuclear negotiations. That was Zarif's senior advisor. He said, if Europeans stop trading with Iran and don't put pressure on U.S., then we will reveal which Western politicians and how much money they had received during nuclear negotiations to make the Iran deal happen. And as I pointed out last week, the Iran deal and the billions of dollars that were turned over, it was a bad deal. As I said, it was an illegal deal. It was an unconstitutional deal. It was a deal that was put together by Obama and Kerry. They couldn't get it passed as a treaty, and it should have been a treaty. It should have been done as a treaty. It was economic as well as military. And so it should have been approved by the Senate. But they decided they wouldn't do that, just like they decided with the Paris Climate Accord and with DACA, they wouldn't go through the legal procedures. They would just do it themselves by executive order. And so when they did that, it was a bad deal. It was an illegal deal. It gave a great deal of money. That money then passed to a lot of European countries that had big contracts, maybe to the pockets of a lot of European politicians, maybe some U.S. politicians. You know, as H.L. Mencken said, an election is an advanced auction of stolen goods. Well, maybe so was this Iranian deal, an advanced auction of stolen goods. It wasn't necessarily Iran's money, as a matter of fact. President Clinton and others had passed some legislation that said this needs to be adjudicated first to determine whether or not victims of terrorism have a prior claim on this money, and there were prohibitions of turning this money back to the Iranians. That's why you had Obama send them plane loads of cash in foreign currencies, because he was violating U.S. law. Yeah, he said, well, we didn't give it to them. We didn't take it out of the Treasury directly and send them Federal Reserve currency notes. We did it with Swiss francs and other currencies and so forth. So we didn't violate the law. See, that's the kind of prevarication that is so typical of the Obama administration. well, we're going to self-ratify this treaty with the Paris Accord, and we're going to self-ratify this treaty with the Iranians, and then we're going to say that we didn't violate the law because we're going to send them the cash in foreign currencies loaded on a plane. At the same time, we get some prisoners there. Oh, and we're not paying ransom for those prisoners either. See, that's the lies that we got from these people. And so when we look at this, and as it passes along, we've now got, over the weekend, a couple of former Obama administration officials writing op-ed pieces, and they're suggesting that the European allies should expel American diplomats. It's absolutely amazing to me. This is going so far beyond the attempted overthrow of the election to continual and direct opposition to this administration's policies. It used to be that when somebody left as president, it's always been the tradition, whether it was Democrat or Republican, they would quietly go to their ranch or whatever, and they would hang out, and they would not have any comments. These people are not only commenting, but they are actively opposing the current administration's policies. Whether you agree with the policies or not, I find this to be a very troubling development here. So you got two former Obama administration officials, reports Zero Hedge, suggesting that America's European allies should punish Trump for withdrawing from the Iran deal and for levying additional sanctions on Iran. They said European countries are obliged to take aggressive steps to preserve the Iran deal in order to avoid becoming Trump's doormat. And the people writing this are putting this in the New York Times. They did it last Thursday. Stephen Simon and Jonathan Stevenson. They were directors on Obama's National Security Council. And, we had that piece come out and says, President Trump looks like had hired a private security firm to investigate some former Obama officials. Why would he do that? I mean, you look at this situation, you got a couple of guys on the National Security Council of Obama telling the European Union this. They say the European Union could, for instance, announce the withdrawal of member states' ambassadors from the U.S. They're encouraging the EU to withdraw ambassadors from the U.S., these Obama officials. And they said, isn't this what states do when diplomatic partners breach solemn agreements? Do you think that the Iranian deal was a solemn agreement? It was only between Obama and Kerry and the Iranian state. He had a law was passed. He didn't want to get 2/3 of the approval of the Senate. So the Congress passed a law saying you can't do that deal. And then Obama vetoed that. And they nearly overrode that. They had 34 votes. If there had been one less vote, they would have overridden Obama's veto. Unless it was Hillary Clinton, that deal was done. So this was not a solemn agreement. But these two guys who worked for the Obama administration said, isn't this what states do when diplomatic partners breach solemn agreements, expose them to security risks, threaten to wreak havoc on their economies? And then they go further. Instead of just saying, maybe you should bring home some of your diplomats in protest, they say, depending on the American response, European capitals might even follow up with an expulsion of American ambassadors. So these Obama officials from his National Security Council are begging Europe in the New York Times. They're begging them to send home to bring back some of their diplomats and to expel American ambassadors. They said it'd be hard to fault these moves as irresponsible. In other words, you should do this, and we won't call you. We'll cheer you if you do this, say the Obama officials. They said the White House would face the first hard choice in this whole process, a full-blown crisis in transatlantic relations. That's exactly what the Obama administration would do. Stay with us when we come back. We're going to take a look at what China is doing. Welcome back. So we have the situation where we've got former Obama administration officials who were on the National Security Council begging Europe to break diplomatic relations with the United States over the Iran deal that they put together over the objections of nearly 2/3 of the Congress and over 2/3 of the American people at the time that it happened, saying this is a sacred compact that has been destroyed. Let me tell you what they're really concerned about, as Iran is saying, if this thing doesn't stay together, we're going to name the corrupt politicians that we paid off to get this deal. It was billions of dollars that came out of the United States that went to these people. And as it flowed to Iran, Iran bought a lot of goods and services from European Union companies. They also bought a lot of European Union politicians. Maybe a lot of those politicians that they bought were in the Obama administration, especially considering how hard they're working on trying to keep this deal going through, to keep the Iranians happy so the Iranians don't out these crooks who sold us out. And as unhappy as I am over this deal, that ship has sailed. They got the money, unfortunately. And now the question is, what happens at this point? But first, let's take a look. We looked at the two individuals who were writing in the New York Times an op-ed piece saying, please pull back your diplomats, and if that doesn't work, expel American ambassadors from your country. And then on Saturday, we got John Kerry again, spotted dining with several Iranian regime officials in Paris. Former senior advisor to Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, Jason Osborne, tweeted, "So John Kerry just left a meeting in Paris at L'Avenue with 3 Iranians. A friend was sitting next to their table and heard John Kerry blasting Donald Trump. The Iranians had a 5-person security detail, and they left in diplomatic vehicles." Is John Kerry FARA registered? In other words, is he registered as a foreign lobby agent? We now got President Trump talking about the Logan Act. And quite frankly, folks, this is exactly what the Logan Act was set up. I understand it goes all the way back to 1798. I understand nobody has ever been charged with this. But this is directly the Logan Act. As Fox News is pointing out, collusion is a dirty word. So where is the outrage over Kerry's secret meetings that continue even after we're out of the deal? He's still continuing with these secret meetings, trying to get the Iranian deal to continue in some way, shape, or form. Where is the outrage over his secret meetings on the Iran deal? They say an Iranian foreign ministry spokesperson confirmed the meetings after the Boston Globe broke the news. And these are the older meetings that happened before President Trump came out of the Iran deal. And he's still doing this, even though people have been talking about this. The Boston Globe talked about how he's acting as a foreign agent. They said, we don't see the U.S. just as Mr. Trump. The United States is not just the current ruling administration, said the Iranian Foreign Ministry. You understand that? They're looking at this and saying, well, you know, he may be officially the president, but he's not really the full government. We've got another government in Washington. You can call it the deep state. You can call it the permanent bureaucracy. You can call it the military, whatever you want. These people see themselves as an ongoing government. And that's why they've worked so hard to create a coup against President Trump to overthrow this election. And as Fox News pointed out, when he says, when the Iranian foreign minister says, we don't see the U.S. as just Mr. Trump, and it's not the ruling administration right now. They said, think about this. Think about what this means. Kerry was working with a sworn enemy of the United States to try to undermine the foreign policy of the elected president of the United States. That is a Logan Act violation, and they quote the Logan Act. They said on Twitter, Trump suggested Kerry might have violated the Logan Act, and here's what it says, some of it. I read this whole thing to you last week. I think it was about a week to 10 days ago that I started talking about this. Any citizen of the United States who, without authority of the United States, directly or indirectly commences or carries on any correspondence or intercourse with a foreign government with the intent to influence the measures or so-and-so and to defeat the measures of the current government. That is the Logan Act. That is what John Kerry is doing. He is violating the Logan Act. He is part of another government that is setting up their own policy, whether or not you agree with the policy that we have here. Just like you have the FBI, the NSA, the CIA deciding that they don't like the outcome of the election and they're going to overthrow it one way or the other. You have the National Security Council of Obama, his Secretary of State, actively opposing Trump and saying that they're going to continue the policy that they set up. But I'm telling you what is even more concerning to me is the fact that we now have, with DACA, again, President Trump understood that he could get out of the Paris Climate Accord, that he could get out of the Iranian deal, that they were just signed by Obama, that they were never ratified. The same thing is true of DACA. Why is the Trump administration, why is Jeff Sessions playing this game with federal judges at the lowest level? who are telling President Trump, no, you can't get rid of DACA, which is just a memo that was signed by the former Homeland Secretary. You can't vet people coming into this country. You can't protect the borders. These are federal judges saying this. There is no law that was ever changed, any more than Obama ever had a treaty with Iran. He never had a treaty with Iran. He never had a treaty with the Paris Climate Agreement. Those are never treaties. DACA is not a law. There's nothing there that needs to be decided in the courts. Nothing whatsoever. Well, we got John Kerry conducting this stuff, and then you have the issue of what the real goal of U.S. policy is. And this is where it gets a bit dodgy. When we look at the fact that John Bolton and others have made it very clear, we've even had a leaked document coming out of the White House that says that they're going for regime change in Iran. And we had John Bolton on Jake Tapper. And let's play video clip number 5, where John Bolton and Jake Clapper go back and forth as to what might happen to people in Europe if they don't go along with us and they continue on this Iranian deal.
With all due respect, I didn't get an answer to the question. Is the U.S. going to impose sanctions on Europe?
On the conduct of other governments.
Okay.
So what he's saying is that we're going to put these sanctions in there. And if European countries continue to trade with Iran after the sanctions, then we're going to take action against them. And I think this is a very dangerous policy. You know, we've had the Europeans, and I understand what their reasons are. They've got a lot of contracts with this. As I said before, they got a lot of money that they made out of those billions of dollars that we turned over. The politicians made a lot of money. They don't want to be exposed. They want to keep this deal going. The policy that Bolton is doing is regime change. And he, on his side, is willing to have essentially an economic war with Europe in order to have regime change in Iran. Does that sound reasonable to you? It doesn't sound reasonable to me. As a matter of fact, they pushed back on this last week, and they said, we don't want to see the United States as the economic policeman of the world. They would love to see us as the unpaid mercenary military policemen of the world, but they don't want to see us as the economic policemen of the world. In other words, they don't want us taking action against their companies that continue to trade with Iran. And we look at where this might go. Take a look at this situation when we come back about this company, ZTE, that President Trump says, we're going to get them back in business. We got to protect these Chinese jobs of this Chinese company. Why are they losing their jobs? I'll tell you the answer on the other side, and it is exactly what we're going to be facing if we go down this road that neocons like John Bolton have laid out for us to confront Europe. We'll be right back. All right, so where this Iran sanction stuff is going, I think it's very interesting when we bring China into it. And China comes into it as we look at these announcements about ZTE. Trump pledges to safeguard Chinese telecom jobs. If you've seen these headlines, you might say, what in the world is going on here? Well, here's what's going on. We had last month, the U.S. Commerce Department blocked American firms from selling parts or providing services to ZTE, which makes smartphones and other telecommunications equipment, reports CNN on Money. The ban was put in place after Washington said that ZTE violated a deal in which the Chinese company agreed to pay a $1.2 billion fine for evading U.S. sanctions on Iran and North Korea. So is this going to be the pattern that we're going to see coming up with European companies as they're doing business with Iran or North Korea, whatever? If they violate those sanctions, the U.S. applies massive fines, like in this case to this Chinese company of $1.2 billion. And ZTE, that said, has about 75,000 employees worldwide. They disputed the decision. They're appealing it. The company, however, upped the stakes last week by saying that it had halted most of its operations because of the ban by the U.S. government, because of the fine by the U.S. government on these sanctions. Now, Trump has pulled back as of yesterday. He tweets out, he said, there's too many Chinese jobs at risk here. The Commerce Department has been instructed to get ZTE back into business. And so I think where this all gets very interesting is when we look at the different ways moving forward. We understand this was an illegal, unconstitutional deal. Two-thirds of America disagreed with this when Obama and Kerry did it. over the objections of nearly two-thirds of the Senate. Only one vote short of them shutting down his ability to do this. They gave them the money. That ship has sailed, folks. That money was then used to buy politicians or to pay them off after the fact. It was used to set up contracts with a lot of different companies in Europe and China and so forth. Now, if we impose sanctions, are we going to get into a situation like we see with ZTE? Is that going to be the policy of the U.S. government? Because the policy, quite frankly, right now is regime change in Iran. We saw the leaked document come out last week, and this is what the document said. So the regime change plan seeks to fundamentally shift U.S. policy towards Iran and has found a receptive audience in the Trump administration, which has been moving in this direction since Bolton, a longtime and vocal supporter of regime change, entered the White House. It de-emphasizes U.S. military intervention, instead focusing on a series of moves to embolden an Iranian population that has increasingly grown angry at the ruling regime for its heavy investments in military adventurism across the region. Sorry about that. And the question then becomes, is there really a difference between regime change in Syria and regime change in Iran? You need to understand that although the American electorate and the different political parties are different on this, the military-industrial complex and Pentagon are not. They understand that they are one and the same thing. There's an article on Zero Hedge by Caitlin Johnston that says why regime change in one means regime change in both. And she said people who are more aligned with the Democrats are typically opposed to the idea of regime change in Iran, but they support it in Syria. When you look at the Republican Party, most people oppose regime change in Syria, but they want it in Iran. So where did this come from? We've had a situation where President Trump has capitalized on the deep state opposition to his presidency to politicize this. And that's what's going on with the people who should understand and should know better that regime change isn't going to work any better in Iran than it's going to work in Syria, folks. It's simply going to make the whole area a lot more dangerous. We've had Iran regime change before. We did it in the 1950s. I think it was 1953. We overthrew their elected president, and we put in a dictator in his place, a Shah of Iran. Talked about this before. That's where this all started. It didn't start when the Ayatollah Khomeini and the revolutionary students took over the U.S. Embassy. That was a response to something that happened a couple of decades earlier. And when we continue to go down this road, just like we've seen in Afghanistan, in Iraq, which just elected a majority government that is sympathetic and allied with the Iranian Shias. And just as we've seen the Lebanese government elect a majority party that is sympathetic to the Iranian Shias, we are losing that battle. And we are creating more enemies. What are the Chinese doing, meanwhile? I mean, we see all this news about ZTE and the fact that we had a Chinese company that got caught up in this. They were going to shut down. Now President Trump said, we'll work with you. We'll make sure that our sanctions don't shut down this company. So are they really going to back the sanctions? Do they really have any leverage if they're going to make an exception for the Chinese company? But even beyond that, how is China playing this? I think China is playing this a lot smarter than the United States is. They're playing it smart. They're not playing it belligerent. The Chinese are trying to make China great. Our policy is to make America poor. That's what being the world's policeman, economic or military, is about. That's what this American empire is about. This is not what we voted for President Trump to do. Not at all. And we're not only making America poor, we're making enemies everywhere. What is China doing, on the other hand? This is an article from Sputnik. The 10 o'clock train to Tehran. China launches a new rail link with Iran as the U.S. is severing ties. See, we're getting belligerent with everybody. We're getting belligerent even with the Europeans, saying, you do what we say, or we're going to start enacting sanctions against your companies. Whereas the Chinese are building railroads to ship their products directly to Iran and other places in the Middle East. In this particular one, this train line that they're talking about goes from a city in China's Inner Mongolia region, an area that produces a massive amount of sunflower seeds, which the Iranians like to consume. And so what they're going to do is they're going to get it, the sunflower seed shipments that are coming out of this one little area, they're going to be able to get it there 2 weeks instead of the month that it now currently takes to ship it by boat. And so they are creating infrastructure. They're creating relationships. And it's not just in this one railroad. They're doing this everywhere. This is something they've been working on since 2013. It's called the One Belt, One Road Initiative with China. And it is a win-win for them and for the Gulf countries. It's a multi-trillion-dollar initiative to set up multiple rail lines. They've been working on this for 5 years, and they're starting to get this through, and they're setting out, they're building infrastructure into East Asia, Europe, and East Africa. They're building relationships. They're building influence. They're creating wealth for themselves. What are we doing? Instead of building infrastructure, instead of building relationships, we are bombing their infrastructure while our infrastructure here in the United States is decaying. And we're creating enemies as we make ourselves more and more poor and as we undermine our own security. Are these people focused on trying to do terrorist attacks in China? No. No, because everywhere we go, we create enemies. No matter what we do, every time we get involved in regime change, we're creating more enemies. And that's precisely what we're doing. The Chinese, on the other hand, said, we think China always will look for new markets for their services. They're manufacturing goods. Every day they're increasing their production. And we can be the market for these goods. When I'm looking at this, I'm saying, okay, these guys really are communists. They have a 5-year plan. They've got a dictator who is creating this cult of worship for himself like Mao. But they're actually, in one way, they're acting more like capitalists than we are. We are acting like the conquering dictators when it comes to our military and foreign policy. They're out there trying to create new markets, to sell their services, to sell their goods, to create relationships with people, not to make enemies out of everybody. They're getting richer. We're getting poorer. We're creating terrorists who want to destroy this country. They're creating relationships. It's absolutely insane when you look at this. We have no infrastructure. We can't build our infrastructure. We can't make America great because we're too busy doing the third Bush administration, which is really what's happening going forward in the Iran deal.